My name's Trevor Joseph. I'm with the California Department of Water Resources. You know, I noticed this is an international conference, so a couple of questions. I'm always interested in these settings. Who's here from outside of California? Can you raise your hands? A few. And then who's here from outside of the United States? Do we have anybody? Gentleman over here. All right, very good. Well, some of this will be certainly secondhand to you folks in California, but today I kind of want to focus on 4 items, and I kind of have a few slides on each one of these. One's California hydrology and groundwater. Again, will be secondhand, really high-level overview of that topic. I'll talk a little bit about the California's groundwater management milestones pre-SGMA. For those of you that attended this morning's presentations by Gordon Burns in particular, Undersecretary Burns. He covered this topic very well at a 30,000-foot view. I'll dive a little deeper on this item and the significance of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. Also focus on these new groundwater sustainability plan regulations, really kind of the keystone of the act, and describe what this means for the state and for local agencies. And then I'll finally focus on the next steps for our department, the California Department of Water Resources. So California's hydrology and groundwater, kind of in a slide. The state here, obviously we're near San Francisco. If you were to divide the state kind of at that line that runs through the Bay Delta, it's important to note that 4/5 of the runoff in the state occurs above that line, north of the California, the Bay Delta, I should say. Yet 2/3 of the water use is actually south of that line. So obviously there's a big discrepancy in terms of where the rain and the runoff occurs in groundwater, or excuse me, total water use. When we look at groundwater in the state of California, there's 515 alluvial groundwater basins as mapped by our department. Of these basins, and some of them are sub-basins, these basins represent about 35 to 65% of the total water supply on an annual basis for the state, depending upon the hydrology. The next slide here just shows kind of the importance of groundwater as it relates to total water use. This might be a little hard to see at this scale, but the larger, lighter blue bar represents total water use, and the darker blue bar is the amount of that water from groundwater. You can see that we have 10 hydrologic regions in the state of California. The Tulare Lake region uses not only the most total water, but also groundwater in the state. Other hydrologic regions, such as the Central Coast, although it doesn't use as large a percent, certainly, of total water supply, you can see the significance of the darker blue bar there, almost equal to that lighter blue bar, meaning that it's heavily reliant on groundwater. The vast majority of the water supply for that hydrologic region comes from groundwater. So hopefully you can get a kind of a sense of the importance of groundwater as it relates to total water use, total water supply in the state. So switching to SGMA, you know, Gordon had earlier a great slide that showed historic SGMA, what was the law, the regulations on groundwater in the California, and it was blank. And that's predominantly true. However, there were a couple of items that further can tell the story of how we got to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So SGMA was became effective, signed into law in 2014, became effective in 2015. Prior to SGMA, there were essentially a series of voluntary groundwater management requirements through law. AB 3030 in 1992, SB 1938 in 2002 set forth a series of requirements for groundwater management plans, but again, they were voluntary. They were a carrot approach. And what I mean by that is that you had to complete groundwater management plans according to these laws in order to receive state grant funds. So this led to kind of variable implementation, as we like to state, that there were areas in California that did groundwater management plans and were successful, but by and large, for the most of the state, that wasn't very successful, and which led to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. A couple of other important notes here is the CASGEM program. I'll explain what that means in a moment. Also another voluntary program for state grant funds to do groundwater elevation monitoring and submit it to the state. And then post-SGMA, we've now ventured into a period where it's required. And I'll explain that in more detail on a subsequent slide. But this requirement really lays out some prescribed requirements for groundwater sustainability plans to be prepared either in 2020 or 2022, depending upon whether or not you're in a critically overdrafted basin as defined by the state. And as Gordon mentioned this morning, you must achieve your goal within 20 years of implementation, so either 2040 or 42. There's also the requirement that if you don't achieve sustainability, if you don't prepare your plans, then there's potential state board intervention, our sister agency, and you'll hear from Eric Ekdahl here in a few moments on his role in other SGMA-related activities. So I briefly mentioned CASGEM. The importance of CASGEM as it relates to SGMA is it defined the priority of the groundwater basins throughout the state. So as I mentioned, there's 515 groundwater basins or subbasins. CASGEM, there was a series of criteria in CASGEM to recognize not just the groundwater problems, but the importance of groundwater in these basins. And so the department, as part of that program, prioritized these basins. So the outcome of that is that there's 127 high and medium priority basins. These are the basins that SGMA applies to. They are required to adhere to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. Depending upon the information, those high and medium priority basins represent about 92 to 96% of the groundwater use in the state. So obviously, those 127 out of the 515 represent the vast majority of groundwater use. And they represent, or the overlying population of those high and medium priority basins is 88% of the total population of the 515 groundwater basins or subbasins. So the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, as I mentioned, was signed in 2014. It became effective January 1st, 2015. There's a quote here, or a partial quote from the governor at the time of the signing, which is really important as kind of guiding principles for the department, but also for just the state in general. And that is that groundwater, or recognition that groundwater management in California is best accomplished locally. And why that's important is the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is different than other state laws. And I'm certainly not an expert at other state laws or other country laws, so please don't ask me questions. But this act really focuses on local control. It's designed so that local agencies have the opportunity to see if they can manage groundwater sustainably before the state can get involved. So it's a little different than some of those other more maybe top-down laws in other states or countries. Another important note here is that the act, let me transition, sorry. The act lays out a series of requirements that weren't there before the act. One is the applicability, as I mentioned, those 127 high and medium priority basins, but also provides definitions. Definitions kind of sorely needed in California's groundwater management. So the Act provides a lot of important definitions. Examples include sustainable yield, what sustainable groundwater management is, and other key terms. From the local's role, and again, like I mentioned, this is a local encouraged law, that they're required, these local agencies, to establish groundwater sustainability agencies if they're going to prepare groundwater sustainability plans. Mentioned again briefly by Undersecretary Burns this morning, but groundwater sustainability plan development must occur by June 30th of 2017. So it's coming up very, very rapidly, and there's kind of been mixed successes in terms of meeting that requirement. There's still time to meet it, but there's been a lot of challenges, as you can imagine, with local agencies determining how they're going to manage these groundwater basins or subbasins. The law also provides power and authorities that weren't available to many of these local agencies pre-SGMA. And then, as I mentioned, these local agencies, unless they're in an adjudicated basin or meet SGMA in another way, they must prepare groundwater sustainability plans. Again, I'll get into that in a few slides. So the state's role. We have a variety of activities that we're working on as it relates to SGMA, both my department and Mr. Ekdahl, the State Water Resources Control Board. The Department of Water Resources, we had regulations for basin boundaries and the aforementioned priority in terms of the importance of those basins and ranking those basins. Basin boundary regulations, kind of in a nutshell, is it allows the local agencies, if they have scientific information that the basin was drawn correctly, mapped correctly by the department 10, 15 years ago, they have had the opportunity to submit scientific information to help us redraw those boundaries. We also found some errors in basin boundary delineation that we wanted to clean up as part of that process. With these subbasins, it also allows the local agencies to perhaps realign some of the sub-basin boundaries based on their own jurisdictional boundaries to optimize groundwater management. So that's a very active project. The department is also providing technical assistance to local agencies. I'll get into that a little bit more in a few minutes. The department, the water resources, we're tasked to evaluate these sustainability plans and make assessments as to whether or not they meet sustainability. And again, the state intervention, the State Water Resources Control Board, our sister agency, is there to potentially enforce these plans if in fact they're not meeting sustainability or haven't been developed. So a little more detail in the roles and responsibilities, at the risk of kind of repeating some of the items I just went through, but it's important again to recognize that DWR has this regulatory and assisting role. The state board's there as the enforcing agency. These new GSAs really have the hardest role, and that is planning and implementing the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And then we have stakeholders around the whole process. And it is important to recognize, and again, I think maybe Undersecretary Burns mentioned this and Secretary Ross, the importance of stakeholder involvement. This was kind of unprecedented with this act, that stakeholders will be most successful if they include beneficial users of groundwater. Some of those are listed in the act when developing these plans. So, the Groundwater Sustainability Plan emergency regulations. So again, we have the governor's quote there, and again, I bring that up because that's been it's been our overarching principle in terms of how we've approached the development of these regulations. So the department had to develop these regulations by June 1st of this year. And they were just approved by the California Water Commission in a 9-0 vote. We were very pleased. The important point here is that all these entities, whether it's the public, the local agencies, the department, I think we're all really focused on meeting sustainable groundwater management. We're going to look at it different ways, but we've got to remind ourselves in the end, that is the goal. And in all the involvement, the public involvement that we've had, the local agency involvement we had this last year in developing those regulations, there was this common theme. And so it gives me a lot of sense of optimism that we are working towards this goal, and through these regulations we'll meet that goal. That being said, not everything in the regulations was supported by all parties, but I did get that sense that we were all pulling towards this end goal. From the department's perspective, we looked at these regulations not only based on the requirements in the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act that were provided to us, but we really needed enough information in these regulations in order to evaluate sustainability. So there was a lot of questions on, some portions of the regulations look very prescriptive, others don't look prescriptive enough. But what we included there in those regulations was what we felt was the minimum, really, to evaluate sustainability. So the regulation articles, and I won't go through all of these, I know we don't have time, but the regulation articles are listed here. For those of you who are not familiar with them, they include items such as technical and reporting standards. We need some standardization between these plans so that we can evaluate adjacent plans and understand what we're looking at. Procedures is maybe self-explanatory, but there's a list of requirements in terms of just the process in which local agencies need to submit these groundwater sustainability plans. I'll go into Article 5 here in a little more detail. Obviously, we need to predetermine how we're going to evaluate these plans. So Article 6 includes how the department, the criteria we'll use to evaluate the plans and the implementation of these plans. There's an annual reporting requirement and a requirement for local agencies to periodically evaluate the effectiveness of their own plan and implement adaptive management. Thank you. If there's multiple plans developed in the same basin or subbasin, SGMA allows for that, but there's an interagency requirement that they coordinate. And then finally, in unique instances, if local agencies already have a groundwater management plan that was robust enough to meet sustainability, or they can show through a series of technical information analysis that they've met the sustainable groundwater management requirement, there is a provision to allow local agencies the opportunity to come in as an alternative to a groundwater sustainability plan. So just a couple of elements within Article, or I should say sections within Article 5. That's the plan content section of the regulations. This is by far the biggest section, or article I should say, of the regulations. We have 5 of these sections or sub-articles. Administrative information, basin setting. So this is really the technical information that water agencies or local agencies need to provide us, including water budget, an analysis of the undesirable results that Undersecretary Burns highlighted this morning, and I'll get into that in a little more detail. A hydrologic conception model, even before a water budget, understanding what the basin or subbasin looks like. Item 3 here, the sustainable management criteria, the hardest section of the article to write, really a description of what is undesirable results in these basins or subbasins, and I'll describe that in more detail. Obviously, monitoring. It really begins with data, and there has to be a sound collection and spatial and temporal frequency distribution of data, and that's laid out here in monitoring network. And then the projects and actions. You know, what actions and projects will local agencies take? When will they take them to meet the sustainability goal? So, undesirable results. There's 6 of them. They're listed in the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And the Act really kind of, the nexus, if you will, of the regulations of the Act in terms of sustainability really revolves around avoiding these undesirable results. Undesirable results can include lowering of groundwater levels, reduction of groundwater storage. This is a map depicting a reduction of groundwater storage in the Central Valley. Seawater intrusion. Obviously, we have some cases of seawater intrusion. Water quality degradation, land subsidence, and depletions of interconnected streams. So the unique aspect of the Act and the regulations is that local agencies are required to work through a process to describe to the department what constitutes undesirable results in their basin. And the process includes that they need to have sound data, technical information as part of that description. They need to describe to us how they've engaged beneficial uses and users of water, what effect these certain conditions would have on those beneficial uses and users of water. So we want to see their homework in terms of how they've described undesirable results in their basin or subbasin, and we may claim that it's not reasonable if at the end we feel that that they didn't do an accurate job in determining, kind of self-diagnosing what's undesirable results in their basin. But this is where I mentioned earlier how the law is kind of a bottom-up approach or a local agency approach driven process to defining sustainability. For the sake of time, I'll move along a little bit. So again, the way and this is maybe a little oversimplification, but really avoiding those undesirable results over that 20-year implementation horizon means that you'll likely be operating to a sustainable yield, you'll be doing sustainable groundwater management, and you'll be meeting a sustainability goal. So again, this is really the outcome that we'll be measuring success. One of the unique, and this is diving a little bit into the details, but how are local agencies supposed to define undesirable results? What we didn't want is really a qualitative description of what an undesirable result might be in the basin or subbasin. So the regulations require that they do a quantitative description of what undesirable results are, and that they use this tool, if you will, of defining minimum thresholds. And they define minimum thresholds based on these predetermined metrics. So for example, lowering of groundwater levels, that they logically use groundwater elevations, for reduction of storage, total volume, seawater intrusion, it's an ISO contour of chloride, and so on and so forth. So we're requiring that local agencies quantify what causes undesirable results in the basin or subbasin through the use of these minimum thresholds. The MO means measurable objectives, and that is a requirement that local agencies describe then, the minimum thresholds is the floor, the measurable objective is what you're shooting for, so that they're not operating at the point at which undesirable results occur in the basin or subbasin. So just real quickly, I know I'm out of time. For the department, our next steps are, as I mentioned, the regulations were adopted. We have a series of activities designed to help local agencies then with development of groundwater sustainability plans. They include developing of best management practices by the end of this calendar year. That's a requirement in the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. We know that's going to be a short duration, and we won't likely get all of the best management practices that may be useful to local agencies. We plan to revise or add additional best management practices in the future. Planning assistance, we have facilitation services to help with that GSA formation, those entities that need to manage and prepare these GSPs. Technical assistance, some items may make more sense for the department to provide. For example, INSAR land subsidence data. Perhaps it's more economical, beneficial that the state provide that, and local agencies can then use that information to define undesirable results. And then Prop 1 funding, there's a little less than $100 million seed money, really, after you spread it out throughout the state, to help local agencies prepare these groundwater sustainability plans. And so we'll be providing that funding assistance. So with that, I know it was kind of a quick overview. There's a lot of additional information on our websites, and our website includes specific subsites for each of the projects that we're working on, BMPs, GSPs, GSAs, and so on and so forth. So if you're interested in more information, we encourage you to look at our website. Thank you.
And don't go away. So for those of you that came in a little late, our third speaker is not able to make it, so we're extending the first two speakers a little bit, and then we'll be back on track. So we have time for a question or two. Are there questions? And I don't know how we're doing this with the microphone. Okay. Great. Thank you.
Yeah, you mentioned that it would be up to the local areas to for them to describe what they consider beneficiary uses. So does that mean that when it comes to industrial water usage, it'll be up to each local GSA to define whether they would have to comply with the same GSA standards as like a farmer, for example?
So if the way I understand your question, yeah, I mentioned beneficial uses and users that local agencies need to describe how they've engaged those entities in determining and just, not only the undesirable results, but the plan itself, in fact. Those list of beneficial uses and users is provided in SGMA. I think it says something to the effect, though, that not limited to, or something along those lines in the Act. I can't recite there are parts of SGMA I can actually recite, but I can't remember exactly all of the beneficial uses and users. But I know it was a very comprehensive list in the Act. But again, it's designed that local agencies really take on the responsibility of if there's others, that they include them in that process, so that that they're building the most kind of comprehensive plan, consensus-driven plan that they can.
Yes, Trevor, thanks for the presentation. I think it's a great initiative. I'm Henrique Chaves, professor of University of Brasília in Brazil. And my question has to deal about, okay, you showed 6 detrimental indicators or indicators of undesirable effects. Have you ever thought about integrating not only those indicators, but also the sustainability indicators, which are beneficial uses or how could I say, improvements and benefits from your management for the local agencies to more or less target their progress in, how could I say, in developing and applying the SGMA and its policy in the future? In other words, I couldn't see very clearly from your presentation what are the sustainability goals. I've seen most of them, the undesirable effects. So how do you proceed with that? Thank you.
Yeah, good question. You know, and we tend to sometimes present this from the glass half empty perspective. You know, these are the items that must be avoided. The sustainability, and we use the term sustainability indicator to really describe when these are not undesirable results. So when they aren't at a significant and unreasonable, which I don't think I included that terminology, but when they're not significant and unreasonable, then they're sustainability indicators in terms of our nomenclature. But there are other methods or vehicles that we use to try to provide guidance to local agencies in terms of avoiding these undesirable results. You know, one in the Act actually, again, is that measurable objective. So there's a requirement that these agencies describe how to avoid these undesirable results. In the California Water Plan, perhaps in our best management practices, we'll shoot to include sustainability indicators and other ways for agencies to reach sustainability without just kind of focusing on the negative, the avoidance.
Okay, last question.
Yeah, Trevor, thank you very much. It's very nice to see that this act recognizes that local management is important. And I was wondering that when you mentioned about the monitoring the progress, who will do that monitoring? Will it be the local agency or the state? And what's the time frame for that monitoring and how that will deal with the climatic variations in the monitoring itself and the security for the farmers to have access to water plan in future for their investments?
Yeah, another good question. You know, monitoring is one of those extremely important, obviously foundational requirements that, frankly, a lot of time it gets pulled back or dropped when there's funding restrictions or in times when there's lack of funding at the state. So in terms of how it works in California is the state does do some monitoring. We have 4 regional offices that collect predominantly groundwater elevation data throughout the state. Is it enough? No, not necessarily. In some areas it provides a good foundation, but it always seems to be augmented by a lot of local agency water level monitoring. But again, that's just water levels. There's water quality programs where their agencies are providing water quality data, but it's an area that we're always trying to improve. Part of that technical assistance arrow that I showed at the end is really for the state to kind of realign its data collection programs. I mentioned subsidence briefly, but really all of those undesirable results, even if we can't collect enough data, we're trying to more align our programs so that we provide quality data to aid in this process. But it seems to always need to be augmented by local agency, and there is a requirement, in that sub-article 4 that local agencies, can build on the CASGEM groundwater elevation data, but they really need to develop the appropriate monitoring frequencies, spatial distribution, so that they can drive down uncertainty as it relates to these undesirable results.